Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our facilitator, Jason Burnett. Jason Burnett is the founder of CrestLeaders, a proven leader, communicator, and strategist. Jason is trained in conflict resolution, management, organizational behavior, coaching, and communication. Jason brings a unique combination of skills and experience to each leader and organization he partners with. As a Giant certified guide, Jason brings tools and resources trusted by businesses and organizations worldwide.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's good to be here with everybody. Looking forward to the time that we're getting ready to spend. And so sit back and engage and get ready because we've got a lot to cover. As we look ahead a little bit on our learning objectives, we really want to help you assess how current leadership behaviors influence ownership and follow through within your teams. We really want to help you distinguish between accountability practices that develop capability and those that create dependence. And we want to implement clear expectations and follow-up behaviors that support a shared responsibility and growth. Um, as we jump in and get into our content for today, we're going to be going through a lot. We're going to have several breakout rooms for you. The idea around those breakout rooms is we're going to have you in the same groups every time. And that is just so that you don't have to spend as much time introducing yourself every time, and we can kind of create some momentum over the course of the hour and a half together. So we'll be keeping you in those groups. If you're having any technical problems or anything, you can jump out of that group and we'll assign you to a different group. In our first session last month, for those of you that were with us, we talked about something that really shows up for almost every leader at some point. We talked about how easy it is to carry too much. Right? We can all relate to that. Not because you're doing something wrong, but it's because you care. You care about the work, you care about your team, you care about outcomes. And because of that, many leaders find themselves stepping in more and more. You're answering questions, you're solving problems, you're making sure things are done correctly. And really, over time, something starts to happen. The leader becomes the place where everything flows, and the team starts to rely on that. And you're building a system that was relying on that. So even if you weren't here for the last session, you've likely experienced this. You step in to help, and it works. Things get resolved faster, problems get handled, quality improves in the moment. But over time, more and more comes back to you. More questions, more decisions, more responsibility. And eventually, many leaders hit a point where they feel stretched thin while their team still needs them for things they wish the team could handle independently. So today is not about whether or not you should carry less. Most leaders already know they're carrying too much. Right? I don't have to tell you that. The real question for us is how do you transfer responsibility without things falling apart? Right? How do you shift the things to other people, transfer responsibilities to those that you're leading without things just collapsing? Right? That's the tension. If you hold on to everything, you burn out. If you let go too quickly, things drop and fall through the cracks. So leadership really requires something in between. It's not doing less, but being much more clear and intentional about ownership. And so here's the idea that we're really going to be building on today. Clarity creates ownership, and a lack of clarity creates dependence. Uh, Many accountability problems are not really about motivation. They're not about whether people care. They're about whether ownership is actually clear. And if it's not clear, it almost always comes back to the leader. All right, so we're going to start with our first breakout. And this is going to be a chance for you to introduce yourselves to one another, get to know each other just briefly. And then I want you to just kind of break the ice a little bit with this question. of where are you currently carrying something your team should own? Okay, so where are you carrying something that your team should own? It could be answering the same types of questions repeatedly. It could be stepping in to fix things. It could be holding on to decisions, kind of a control thing. It could be following up on work that others should be tracking. All right, so you'll have just a few minutes, introduce yourself, and a few instructions. Make sure your camera and mic are on so we can see each other's pretty faces, right? Point the camera at your smiling face, so not at your forehead. Okay. Let's see your face, and then come back into the main room if you need to. If you're in a group where others are unable to participate, right? So if you happen to get into a group where people aren't participating, come back to the main room and we'll assign you to another group that will work better for you. If you're having technical difficulties, come back to the main room as well. And note that when you're using the chat feature in the breakout room, it's just for that group and it's not going to be seen by other groups or by the main room. And really watch the clock. Okay. So we're going to set a timer for 5 minutes, which is not a lot of time for this conversation. Think about where are you currently carrying something your team should own. Make sure you introduce each other. Let's go ahead and get everybody into their breakout rooms. All right, welcome back. We've got a few more seconds and everybody else is going to be joining us. We'll wait for everybody to get back into the room and then we'll get going into our next section. All right, just a few more seconds and everybody else will be back with us. Looks like we're closed the rooms and everybody's back. So hopefully that was a good conversation. Hopefully you had time to introduce yourself to one another and just kind of break the ice a little bit with this question of where you're currently holding on to something. We're going to build on that a little bit more as we go ahead and continue. What we're going to do next is really look at what's actually happening in the gap of ownership. Okay. There's a gap between we talked about it and it actually happens. And because that gap is where accountability, that's the gap where accountability either works or it breaks down. So we're going to talk through this idea of the ownership gap. Um, let's take what you just named in your breakouts, put some language to it, because most of what you described is not random. It follows a pattern, and the pattern shows up in a very specific place. It shows up in that gap between we talked about it and it actually happens, right? So we talk about it, but then does something actually happen? What is the gap between those two? And we're going to call that the ownership gap. It's the space between a conversation and a consistent follow through. It's where things get delayed. It's where things get partially done. It's where things get revisited multiple times. It quietly or quietly come back to you as the leader, right? And most leaders experience this gap on a regular basis. You delegate something, you have a conversation, you feel aligned in the moment, and then it doesn't move the way you expected. So what happens next? The leader steps back in and tries to fix that. When that happens, most leaders default to one of a few assumptions. They think they didn't understand it, or they think that they're not taking it seriously, or they need more direction, or I should just handle this to make sure it's done right. And sometimes those things are true, but not most of the time. Most of the time, the issue is much simpler. The issue is not motivation. The issue is clarity. The real issue is clarity. Who owns it? What success actually looks like? What decisions they're allowed to make? And how progress will be tracked. When those things are unclear, the work doesn't move cleanly. And when the work doesn't move, it comes back to you. Okay? So here's the key insight I want you to hold on to. If ownership is unclear, the leader still owns it. Okay? If ownership is unclear, leadership still owns it. Even if you said, "Can you take care of that?" or "Let's make sure this gets done," or "Follow up on this." If it's not clear who owns the next step, it defaults back to you. And over time, this is creating a predictable cycle. You delegate, there's partial follow through, you step back in, and then two things happen. You carry more than what you intended, and the team becomes less clear about what they actually own. And that's where accountability starts to break down. Not because people don't care, but because the structure isn't clear enough to support ownership. Okay? All right, so I want to make this a little bit more concrete. I want you to go back into your breakout rooms, and I want you to think about a real situation where something didn't follow through the way you expected. Where was the gap? Okay. Specifically, was ownership unclear, or was success unclear, or were decision boundaries unclear, or was follow-up unclear? Where was that gap? Talk through that. We'll be in our groups for about 5 minutes, continuing to get to know each other, continuing to have these conversations around the idea of ownership. So think about a real situation, very specifically, where was the gap? Let's go ahead and move into those groups. All right, welcome back. We'll give just a few more seconds for everybody to get back into the room and get settled. All right. Let's see, is that everybody? Yes, that's everybody. Welcome back. All right, so hopefully you were able to have a good conversation around kind of where the gap is between these things, right? The gap between what you communicated and what actually happened. So the next question for us is, what do leaders do in that moment, right? So how do we fix that gap? We've got those moments that you just named. Something isn't moving, follow through is unclear. It would be faster to just step in. Every leader faces this moment regularly, right? And in that moment, there are really two paths. You can either develop capability, or you can create dependence, right? Are you developing capability in these moments for your people, or are you just creating more and more dependence on you as the leader? Most of the time, this is not a conscious decision, right? Because we don't want to create dependence. Like, we're not trying to do that. It's more a reaction. It's when we're not intentional with our leadership. So I want to give you a simple way to think about what's happening in that moment. And that is with what we call the development square. If you've been in some of my workshops in other contexts, I've used the development square often. So if you've seen it before, this is just a little bit of a review. If you're seeing it for the first time, let's kind of walk through it and see what the different components are. What it's really doing is it's describing how people develop skills over the course of 4 different stages. The first stage is across the top there, which is unconscious incompetence. Unconscious incompetence is right at the beginning. Someone doesn't yet know what they don't know, right? I'm unconscious, I don't know, and I'm incompetent. I don't know what I don't know. Okay. So that's the first stage. That's the starting spot where people start. And oftentimes there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of energy, and people are optimistic about what they can accomplish, right? When I teach my kid how to ride a bike, before she starts riding the bike, she's confident that she can do it, even though she's never done it before, right? The second stage is this conscious incompetence. This is where you become aware, the conscious, but you're not yet confident. You're incompetent in how you're doing things. So this is where my daughter jumps on the bike and immediately falls because she doesn't know what she's doing, right? And now she's aware of the challenge of this skill that she's learning. The third stage is conscious competence. This is now where you're building the skill. You still have to really think about it. You've got it, you've got the skill down, but it's not yet routine. It's not yet at a place where you are mastering it, right? So this is you're beginning to build the skill. This is where my daughter's riding the bike a little bit. She's still a little wobbly. Maybe she has the training wheels on a little bit. She's figuring it out, but she's still having to focus on the physics of how the bike works, right? Eventually, where we want to get is this fourth stage where everything becomes natural and automatic. This is unconscious competence, where I don't have to think about it anymore. Now, as we look at these four stages, and I could spend an entire workshop just on this model itself, and we don't have time for that. We're just using it as kind of an introductory to think about how people develop. Um, Most of the development is happening in that second stage, that conscious incompetence. That's the stage where someone is aware, but they're not yet confident. And this stage is the most uncomfortable to be in. This is where people start to hesitate, they second guess, they move slower, they make mistakes, they ask more questions. And if we're not careful, they can become really discouraged in that and get into what we call the pit of despair. And this is a place where they can get stuck and unable to move forward. But when they're in this second stage, from a leadership perspective, from your perspective, leading them, this is the moment that often feels inefficient, right? Because they're having to work hard at it and they're not as proficient at it as you would like for them to be. And so you're having to work really hard in this stage. You're having to give them a lot of time. You're having to give them a lot of encouragement. You're having to give them a lot of vision for what the role is. And this is where you can start to say things like, this would be so much faster if I just handle it myself, right? Just swoop in and do it yourself because they're not getting it done the way you want to get it done. And that instinct really makes sense, but it creates a problem and it throws them into that pit of despair more quickly or gets them stuck in that pit of despair. And so with this model, the shift in our thinking is the struggle in that stage two is not the problem. Removing the struggle too quickly is, right? If I don't allow my daughter to fall a couple times, if I don't allow her to get wobbly, if I don't allow her to really learn how to ride the bike, if I just like jump on the bike and do it for her, right? She's never going to learn, right? The goal is not the bike getting down the road. The goal is her learning how to use the bike. I could get the bike down the road much faster myself, but I'm trying to teach her to do it. And so if you remove that struggle too quickly, then they don't have the opportunity to learn. When the leader jumps in too quickly, the work may get done, but the person doesn't grow. And over time, that creates the pattern that we don't want. Think about how this connects to what we just talked about, right? That ownership gap. And someone is in that uncomfortable stage of development. The leader often closes that gap by stepping in, fixing it, answering it, taking it back. And in that moment, that ownership gap is solved, but ownership is weakened because we're not thinking about the development of people. Most leaders don't do this because they want control. Some do, but for the most part, it's not about control. What it's really about is they really care about the outcomes, or they really want to support their team, or they don't want things to fail, and so they swoop in and start to save things. One of the things we talked about last month that I just want to remind you of is that the over-functioning leader leads to an under-functioning team. Right? So the over-functioning leader who swoops in and does too much too quickly creates an under-functioning team. And we want high-functioning teams. We don't want under-functioning teams. So over time, the system learns something. The team learns when it gets hard, bring it back to the leader, right? And the leader learns if I don't step in, it might not get done right. And that loop just reinforces itself. And that's how dependence gets built. Um, all right, so one more quick breakout. I know these are short and these are going fast.
Sorry, Jason, there's one quick question in the comments
Oh,
or in
sorry,
the
I
chat.
can't. Thank you for calling that out because I can't read that and talk at the same time. So
You are fine. I can read the question for you. It says, will
I,
you be addressing how to manage employees who are unwilling to take feedback to move them from unconscious incompetence? And then there's a clarifying piece to that that says the ones who don't want to see they need feedback because they just know they're already doing everything correctly.
yeah, that's a tough one. And what happens is people get stuck in that pit of despair and or what happens is they're earlier in the stages of development than they'd like to admit. And I would say that they're stuck in stage one. And so your job is to bring awareness to them of how those gaps are being missed. So we're not going to address this question directly, but some of the tools that we're bringing in would help start to fill in those gaps for them. The more clarity around what done looks like, that we're going to talk about in a moment, the more clear things are, the greater the opportunity for them to see where that gap is in their development. And so a really challenging situation. We'll kind of touch around it, but not dive into it in too much detail. So thanks for calling the question out for me. We're going to move into another breakout. And in this breakout, I want you to think about your own team and where are you stepping in too early and interrupting development. Okay, so are you swooping in too early and filling in that gap too quickly, thinking about the stage of development on the development square? Where are you jumping in too quickly and interrupting their development? Okay, so have a conversation around that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be back in here to continue on. Welcome back. We've got a few more seconds before everybody gets back into the room. We'll wait for them to join back in. All right. I think we've got everybody jumped back in. I know 5 minutes can be really short sometimes if the conversation is flowing. So just acknowledge that sometimes these breakout rooms move a little bit quickly, but for the sake of our content, we got to keep going. Hopefully you had a good conversation about those times that you swoop in a little bit too early. You're getting a little bit more clarity around how you're showing up as a leader and some of the implications of that and the ripple effects of that on your team. Um, just a reminder, leadership is not about removing difficulty from the system. It's about helping people grow through it. So you're not just trying to make it easier for them, you're trying to help them grow through it and work through those stages of development. And that really requires something different, not stepping away completely and not stepping in too quickly, but staying engaged while still allowing ownership to remain with the other person. So the question really becomes if stepping in too quickly creates dependence and stepping back too far creates confusion, what does it actually look like to transfer ownership clearly? And so this is where things start to get a little bit more practical as we talk about ownership clarity. The problem is not effort, and it's not just development. Um, the real issue becomes what actually creates ownership. Okay, that's our question. What creates ownership? Because most leaders don't intend to create dependence, right? We're not trying to create dependence. That's burning us out. It happens because something is missing, and most of the time, what's missing is clarity. And so this principle again that we mentioned earlier, clarity creates ownership. Lack of clarity creates dependence, right? So if ownership is not clearly defined, it doesn't stay with the team. It comes back to the leader. So let's look at where this usually breaks down. Most delegation conversations sound something like, hey, can you take care of that? Or let's make sure this gets done. Or follow up on this, right? In the moment, that feels clear, but underneath that, several things are often missing. And so we really need 4 clarity anchors to really help us can close in that ownership gap and really actually transfer it. And so back to the conversation in the chat earlier, I think some of these will help answer some of those situations. There's probably a lack of clarity around what is actually expected or where they're actually at on the development square. And so this is going to help us gain a little bit more clarity. So the first step or the first anchor for us is who owns it. Now, this sounds obvious. If I say, hey, you do this, it should it should indicate that they're owning it, right? But oftentimes this is a little bit more vague than that. If multiple people are involved, or if it's just implied, ownership becomes shared. Okay? And shared ownership often means no one fully owns it. Like the whole thing, if everyone's in charge, nobody's in charge, right? If there's not one owner of something, then no one fully owns it. So clear language here sounds like who is responsible for the next step? You are responsible for the next step, right? Sabrina, you're responsible for this next step. It's clear on who owns it, right? There's no question of whether or not the group owns it or ambiguity around the next step of owning it. And I as the leader, I don't own it because I've now indicated who does. The second one, the anchor that we really need is what does success look like? This is one that we really miss. Leaders often assume others know what done means. And this kind of goes back to the question in the chat. Is there clarity around what a complete job looks like? What does success look like? What does done look like? And are there measurables around what done looks like? Because different people define done differently, right? My definition of what this completed project looks like can be different than what your definition is. So what does success look like? Without clarity here, work often gets partially completed or it gets reworked or it gets delayed. A clear language here sounds like what does done look like for this? And what does done look like for this? You're defining, here's the box that we're trying to fit into. Okay. The third one is what decisions do they control? This is one of the biggest gaps, right? Because there's a lack of clarity around authority. A team member may be responsible for the task, but they're unsure of what they're allowed to decide, right? Can they decide on the budget? Can they decide on the vendor? Can they decide on the format? What can they decide? What is within their control? Um, if they're unsure about what they're allowed to decide, then they pause or they escalate or they may wait for approval. So clear language here sounds like, what are you deciding on your own and what needs to come back to me? Okay, so do they know what they need to decide on their own? Do they know what that looks like? And what do they need to come back to you for? Okay, what authority do they have here for their control? And then the fourth one, really important here, is when do we reconnect? Right? Without a follow-up point, one of two things happens. The leader checks in too often or doesn't check in at all, right? I delegate it and forget it, right? Or I'm constantly checking in and checking in and checking in. Like neither one of those are building ownership. Clear language says, when should we check back in on this, right? So this would look something like, you own this. This is what done looks like and what success looks like. You can make decisions A, B, and C, but come to me for D, and we're going to check back in on this next Monday. And so it's very clear each of the four anchors are there. And so there's more clarity around what is happening, and that helps close that ownership gap. So when these four things are clear, ownership stays with the team. When they're not clear, ownership drifts back to the leader. It's going to come back to you, right? So remember this again, what we said before, if ownership is unclear, the leader still owns it, right? So if you don't have those four anchors bringing clarity, you're still going to own it, even though you didn't intend to own it. And you intended to delegate it. You may have said it out loud, but clarity And these clarity anchors really determines where ownership actually sits. Okay. All right, so we're going to do another breakout, and what I want to do for this breakout is I want to have one volunteer, maybe two if you have time, but start with at least one. One person in your group share a real situation where you have delegated or something that you need to delegate. Okay. And then the other people in the conversation, I want you to be kind of coaches for them and ask them some questions. Ask who owns it. Ask what does done look like. Ask what decisions do they control. Ask when do we reconnect. Okay. And so work through that. You're helping them gain clarity by coaching them through these different anchors. Okay. If you get through that in enough time, go to another person and ask them what's a decision or what's something that they're delegating or need to delegate and kind of work through the same thing with them. You'll probably only have time for one or two. And so ask for a volunteer, but work through as many people as you can in the amount of time that you have. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and go into our breakouts for that conversation. Remember, you're being coach. Most of you are being the coach, and one person's kind of on the hot seat answering the questions. Okay. All right. We'll see you all in about 5 minutes. All right. Welcome back in. Hopefully you were able to get through at least one or two people going through that process. Drop the slides down because I'd like to debrief a little bit. What was that experience like? What did you notice as you were working through those clarity anchors? So maybe if you were in the hot seat, how did that work? How was that process for you? Was that helpful for you? Just kind of reflect back on that process a little bit. Who could share for us what that was like? Zachary, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah. So I volunteered. We talked about something that I've recently delegated. And, the questions were pretty straightforward, except for the last one, like, what's the follow-up, essentially, or how do you guys reconnect?
Okay.
And I was like, that's a good question. And it led to me, like, saying, like, I haven't been super consistent with the reconnecting part. And I was like, and the people in my group were very supportive and gave good advice, but I was just like, it was kind of eye-opening where I was like, yeah, you know what? On the reconnecting piece, I've told myself and my bosses that I'm gonna be very consistent about it, but because of schedules, it's been difficult. So it actually was a really productive insight.
Good, good. Yeah, it's that last one gets dropped often, right? Because we are so busy, we move on to the next thing, and
Hmm.
once we hand something off, we kind of forget about it, right? And assume that it will get taken care of, and there's not really a clear next step of when we're going to be checking in around it. So good. I'm glad you were able to have some insight there. Maria? Oh, you're still on mute.
It was interesting in the beginning phases when we're deciding like the timeline and when these things would be happening is that as we started thinking about the level of competency with the person, the timeline was out further and further, adding more trainings involved and more oversight and that sort of stuff, so that taking a brand new person from knowing nothing to knowing the task all the way through, just kind of in the beginning was like, oh, in 30 days we'll be able to have this sort of thing done. But then after we start looking at it, it's like, well, wait a minute, we need to start adding in this training and that training and really dissecting the task down into smaller pieces and understanding that the person needs more time.
Yeah. Timing on the development square, in the middle of the square is a clock. We didn't talk about the clock being in the middle of the square there. It takes time, right? And it probably is going to take a lot more time than you expect or think it will, because you assume that people are further around the square than they really are, or that they'll move quicker around the square, and then they get stuck in that stage two or in that pit of despair, and you have to take a few steps back before you can take a few steps forward. So. Someone else share with us what insight did you have, or how was it going through those anchors with your discussion group? Who else was in the hot seat that would like to share with us about their experience?
For me, one of the questions was, what would success look like? And I had to think about it, and it's clearly communicating what my wants and needs are for that situation. So not panicking and just rambling, but just communicating exactly what my needs are and my wants are at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, really clearly defining that and not just letting that live in your head and making assumptions that they know how to read your mind is really, really an important anchor to hold into. Okay. I think we have time for just one more. What's one more? Somebody who went through that process, or some of you who were the question askers. What did you observe in that process? How do those anchors impact you and your delegation?
I think it's really important that it's clear what it looks like, the clarity of what success somebody was just talking about, but also um like be able to see what the end result looks like so we know
Mhm.
what to get to. I
Right.
think that was really uh helpful.
Right. Yeah, the idea of what does done look like, right? It's not just success, like what you accomplish, but this is what the complete thing looks like. It is, this task at completion is this. That's really good. Okay. All right. Well, let's continue on. Let me get the slides going back up here. And we'll keep moving and dig in. We're going to just get a little bit more and more practical. All right. So we're not trying to create a completely new system, right? These are small shifts in how you communicate. Most of those small shifts create very different outcome, right? More clarity, more ownership, less rework, less follow-up, falling back on you. And so if we can make ownership more clear, there's another piece is clarity alone isn't enough. Really, leaders also need to stay engaged. So how do you stay engaged without taking back control, right? There's this kind of dance back and forth. How do you do that? And that's where accountability really comes in. And so that's what we want to talk about is what does accountability look like? We don't have time to go into real depth here, but we're just kind of building on this idea of delegation and what it looks like to stay engaged. We've talked about who owns it. We've talked about what success looks like. We've talked about what decisions they control when you reconnect. That's what transfers ownership. But there's still a question that comes next. What do we do after that? Right. So we've done those things, and maybe they're still needing more, right? That hasn't been enough to close that ownership gap. What do we do after that? This is where many leaders get pulled back in. And so even when ownership is clear, progress might be slower than you want, or there's mistakes that happen that need to be corrected, or things might not be done exactly how you wanted them. And so you need to go back and redefine what done looks like and what success looks like. In those moments, the pull for you is strong. You're being pulled back into it to step in, to correct, to take it back. And so accountability is not just about clarity, it's about how you stay engaged without taking over. Okay. Last session, we talked about the support challenge matrix, and I want to bring that back to your attention again as we think about how we apply this to the idea of accountability. You don't need to remember the whole model. For those of you that weren't here, just really quickly, the vertical axis is support. So at the bottom, we've got low support. At the top, we have high support. The horizontal axis to the left is low challenge, and to the right is high challenge. Where we want to be is in that liberate quadrant where we're calibrating both high support and high challenge. If we just have support without challenge, we're in the protect quadrant. If we just have challenge with no support, we're in the dominate quadrant. We really want to calibrate the two. So let's apply this to the idea of accountability. When leaders lean too far towards support, right, there's really high support, but not a lot of challenge. They'll step in quickly to save. right? I'm going to jump in and save you. I'm going to fix it for you. I'm going to remove all the obstacles, right? Those are all high support activities. And that really results in dependence on you. If it's all support and no challenge, it's just becoming more and more dependent on you. But if you move too far toward challenge, this is where you're raising the bar, you're holding them account, you're raising the bar, you're giving them measurables, you're setting goals, you're really intense around the deliverables of this thing, but you're not providing them the support. What you can end up doing is, as a leader, you end up in a place where you're just dominating them, right? So we don't want dependence. We don't want dominance. We want some healthy balance between the two, because healthy accountability really sits in the middle of those two extremes, right? So it looks like ownership staying with the person, right? You're not taking ownership back. You're staying engaged. You're keeping expectations clear, which is a challenge function. But you're also following, your follow through is visible, right? So you're staying visible with them. You're checking in with them at the times that you agreed upon. You're not forgetting about them, right? You're staying in there. So the line I want you to hold on to really clearly is, sorry, I think I'm off on slides here. Sorry. So this is what a healthy accountability looks like, right? Ownership stays with the other person, the leader stays engaged, expectations remain clear, follow through is visible. So those are some components of healthy accountability, and we can see how those are balancing both support and challenge. Okay. So the key thing I want you to hold on to is, accountability is not pressure, it's clarity plus follow through. Okay, so accountability is not just this high pressure, get it done, get it done, get it done. It's providing all the clarity. Remember those clarity anchors with follow through and engagement with them. Okay. So what does this actually look like? It sounds like things that would be like, walk me through where this is right now, right? So that is the ownership stays with them, but they're reporting into you. You're checking in and you're staying engaged. Walk me through where things are right now. What's your next step? Is a helpful question to ask. So it helps you understand, do they understand the process? Ownership is still staying with them, but you're staying engaged. What are you running into? This helps with the problem solving, but it stays with them and doesn't just bounce that problem solving back to you. What support do you need to move this forward, right? If we're going to provide both support and challenge, ask them, what support do they need? Do they need more training? Do they need more information? Do they need more clarity? Are they missing one of the anchors? Ask them what they need to move it forward. Ownership is still staying with them. They're the ones who have to move it forward, but you're just asking them what support they need in that process. You're staying involved, but you're not taking it back. They're keeping it. Okay. So this is a very subtle shift from, I need to make sure this gets done, to, I need to make sure ownership stays where it belongs. That's accountability, keeping the ownership where it needs to belong. Okay. All right. So in our next little breakout here, let's kind of build off of this idea. Where do you tend to drift when things aren't moving? So thinking about that support challenge matrix, do you tend to move into more high challenge, where maybe you're in more of that dominate kind of mode, or do you move more into that support mode, where you tend to protect, where you're trying to rescue and do it for them? Okay, where do you tend to be when things are not moving? Do you jump in with challenge? Do you come in with support? Where do you find yourself on that support challenge matrix? Okay. All right. So just discuss that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back in for our final little segment. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully a good conversation there about support challenge and kind of where we tend to gravitate to and how we might balance both of those. When I'm coaching clients, I really work with, if they're having people problems, I take them to the support challenge matrix, and there's probably one of those two missing, right? There's probably too much support or too much challenge, and balancing both of those is going to bring greater clarity and greater accountability. The goal is not to remove pressure, right? We need the challenge. The goal is to apply it appropriately, to stay engaged, to keep ownership clear and not lose those clarity anchors, and really to allow people to grow into responsibility over time. All right, so we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. We've got our last little segment here, and then we'll be done. Let me bring it back to the simplest version of today. Most leaders are not struggling because they don't care, right? You all care as leaders. The struggle is really that ownership is not as clear as you think it is, right? So ownership is not as clear as you think it is. You think it might be clear, but it's not as clear as you think it is. And things keep coming back to you because of that process. Okay. So today we talked about where the ownership gap shows up, about how stepping into quickly interrupts the development. Think about that development square. Talked about how clarity actually transfers ownership using those clarity anchors. And we talked about how to stay engaged without taking it back using that support challenge matrix. Okay? None of this requires a complete overhaul. These are all small shifts that can make a big difference. This changes how responsibility moves through your team. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up with some personal reflection, coming up with a little bit of an action plan. Okay, I want you to walk away with something tangible today, something that you're going to do differently, something that you're going to shift in your behavior. Okay. To do that, I want you to spend a few minutes reflecting on these questions. I want you to kind of journal in your handout or on a blank piece of paper or type it into whatever device you have. Answer these questions. The first one is where am I currently over carrying responsibility, right? So where are you carrying too much? Think about that. Give some real honest, vulnerable answers there. Really be honest with yourself. Number two, what is one thing I need to transfer back to my team? Okay, so if I've got something that I've been carrying too much, what is it that I can transfer back to my team? And then third, and this is where the action really plays out, what exact language will I use to create clarity? So think about the clarity anchors, think about support challenge, think about what actual language you would use, draft it out, how you would say it, not general ideas, but actual words that you'll say, okay? All right, I'm going to give you about 2 or 3 minutes of space just to write, and I'll come back to you in just a few minutes. All right, so we don't have time to go back to our breakouts to share, but I do want us to share because I think that provides some of the accountability, right, of being able to kind of speak out the things that we're committing to. And so I'd like for you, if you would, in the chat real quickly, just in just like one sentence, what is something that you're transferring back to the team? So just kind of your answer to question number 2. You don't have to type out all 3 answers, but I just want you to type out, what is it that you're going to transfer back? Just throw that in the chat as just kind of a way of verbalizing it and kind of throwing it out into the universe to say that you're going to do it, right? Go ahead and start putting that in there. Okay, so we've got ownership, we've got proofreading of a document, training responsibilities, trainings, the 4 anchors, good, trainings, ownership, making sure things, reaching out for help, that's really good. Time management is a really good one. Staff meeting, right? So those are things that can be transferred to other people. Defining authority, okay, proofreading, ownership of client file competencies. Okay, so all really good things, and want to encourage you to really hold on to that document, really use those anchors and the support challenge matrix to think about how you're developing people, not just taking things on for them, okay? So as we wrap up, here's what I really want to leave you with. If you don't change how you transfer ownership, you will keep carrying it. And leadership is not about doing more. It's about being really clear enough that others can carry responsibility well. And that's where your capacity comes back. That's where your team begins to grow. Okay, so I appreciate your time today. In our next session, we're going to build on this as well, because when ownership is clear, or even when ownership is clear, you still have to make decisions under pressure, right? So we're going to talk about decision making and some of the challenges of decision making. I'm going to turn it back over to the team for our final little closeout with instructions. I appreciate you all.